food in the professional world, it's a coin flip everywhere you go. I've had to control or oversee all the food before, and oh my gosh, I don't know if I wish that upon my worst enemy.
And here we are. Welcome, Mr. Andrew Hauser, to Health Hacker Life. How's it going, man?
Good. It's good to be on. Good to be here.
Yeah.
A lot to catch up.
We sure do. I guess for those listening, Andrew and I first got connected. I think you reached out to us, my wife and I, after you saw that article on ESPN and our shared passion around quality nutrition. And then we ended up nerding out on all things, just overall kind of recovery hacking, health hacking, and just kind of, just some cool ways to just leverage, new things that actually make a difference for people in their journey. And so that's what I'm excited to dive into, is like how you live on the cutting edge, your expertise. And why don't you go ahead and just start by telling everyone a little bit about who Andrew Hauser is and a little bit about your story and your work in the world.
Yeah. So I work in kind of the private sector now. This is going on my second year, but I was in Major League Baseball for 15 years roughly. So strength coach, athletic trainer, just kind of worked my way up, grinding it out in the salt mines, as they say. And then I was the director of player health and performance for the Atlanta Braves. So just overseeing kind of everything, strength, medical, nutrition, just kind of trying to bring it all together. And then I was the director of performance rehab for the Dodgers. And then this is my last year in baseball was 21. So got into the private space after that, and a lot of rehab. It's kind of a mix of rehab, training, a lot of hands-on work, but really at this point trying to make sure like everything, make a 5-star experience, for the clients you work with. And that's really what put us together in the first place. So it's like I was looking into, all right, you have a doctor network, you have your blood work set up, and then you have to have food options for these guys, because whether people like to believe it or not, like food in the professional world, it's a coin flip everywhere you go. And it's, in some sports, it's gotten dramatically better over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But I mean, it's still got a long way to go, especially when you're just talking about the ability to not only recover day to day, but also just fuel yourself. There's quality control can be a problem. There's a lot of sports where it's like they're overfed but undernourished, I would say, if I could put it in a simple way. That being said, I don't know, like I've had to control or oversee all the food before, and oh my gosh, I don't know if I wish that upon my worst enemy. You just get when you're doing it for 25, 30 guys or gals, like you get a good sense of just how emotionally involved food is for people. You're not going to make everybody happy. That's where it's kind of like politics. But yeah, there's a huge emotional tie to what people are putting in their bodies. Totally. So yeah, that was an eye opener for sure, as you guys see always. But yeah, so that was kind of a long-winded answer. I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona. And then, so I see predominantly pro athletes, but I see some general population as well. And then I travel to see some athletes as well.
Awesome. Great. Love it. So you're less than 2 years removed from being in professional sports, working for, like you said, the most recently the Dodgers, which I believe you won a World Series with them. Is that right?
Yeah, 2020. Um, yeah, that was an experience. I mean, the World Series by itself was incredible, but that year obviously was the pandemic year. It felt like 3 seasons combined into one that year. So I know we played less games, so there's that side of it, but it was I wouldn't even say organized chaos. It just felt like chaos all the time. So we had about a month and a half, maybe no, probably a month where we didn't go in at all. Spring training just shut down, and then we started like hypersensitive rules. Especially, I mean, nobody really knew what was going on, but especially in California. And then, yeah, things got going. No fans. We didn't actually have fans in the stands, I want to say, until the postseason, where they started letting people in. And yeah, then we were in a playoff bubble for almost 7 weeks during that. So It was the hotel, the ballpark, and back. You couldn't go anywhere else.
Yeah, that was such a weird year for everyone, a big transition in our world. And I guess, did that year play a role in you wanting to go private, or what was it that led you to make that transition?
So honestly, that was the first year where I was like, I don't know if I can I don't know if I personally wanted to do it anymore. Now, again, I never say never. Like situations arise and whatnot that are just great fits. But when you start having those thoughts, it's usually like it just snowballs. And then in 21, my wife found out she was pregnant, so that was also a big. All right, like I'm on you're home a week, gone a week for 7-8 months, and then spring training for about 2 months on top of that. So it's just a lot of time away. And then even when you're home, which in my role in Atlanta would have been even more extreme, like your phone's ringing nonstop too. So it's like, even when you're home, you're not really home.
Jeez. Right. Yeah, you're physically present, but like, mentally, emotionally, you're focused on the team and the season. Yeah, it's so for all pro athletes, we've seen just how grueling seasons can be. And of course, baseball's right up there with one of the more grueling ones in terms of number of games played and just the East Coast, West Coast travel. And I've just heard horror stories of, people getting in on the East Coast after a West Coast trip at like 4 or 5, 6 a.m. And so it's a lot. It's a lot on their bodies and not just the players, but of course the staff. So there were a few things, some personal things. Congratulations, by the way, on the addition to
Thank you.
to the family. And okay, so you made the transition to go private, and now, like you said, you're doing some hands-on work. I guess tell us a little bit about kind of what you would say. What are you most excited about in terms of the hacks, the modalities, the therapies that can make the biggest difference that you either bring up to your client base for them to consider, or that you actually offer them?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, like, you get more and more technology or access to different things, and you start to go more and more just back to some basic principles, some basic physiological principles, and especially in pro sports. So I would say, what really got me, like, I've always been somebody that was always looking for just better ways of doing things. Man, in the last 5 years, I got turned on to something called Moxie Monitor, which is tracks muscle oxygen saturation. I learned a ton from a group down in Austin, Texas called Evolve. And three guys there: Pat Estes, Brian Kozak, and Aaron Davis. Three really sharp guys, and that was for me a really good nudge into even more physiological principles on how I'm why I'm doing what I'm doing, just driving intent. So I mean, that was a real fork in the road or turning point for me, where there's a lot of things I've career wise, from a just hands-on perspective, active release was very foundational for me. Dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, DNS was very ground floor for me, as well as postural restoration. And then you just start stacking these different things over the years. Just again, you're always just searching for ways to do things better. And then how do they fit together? That's the artistry, I think, of whether you're a strength coach, trainer, PT, whatever, as you start to acquire these different skills, it's putting them together and making sure they fit into each situation. But the Moxie, it was wow, okay, this is really tying in a lot of things. That's where it started really tying in, in all these other systems, PRI, DNS, sorry for the acronyms, but there's a huge respiration component. And that was the first time though with the Moxie where I was wow, all right, I'm seeing this in real time, how this can change everything. What's happening in my leg right now, I can change that with my breath. So the tension I'm pulling in my leg, or my vasodilating for more recovery. I want more, trying to drive hemoglobin up, or you have all these physiological things that they just started to explain a lot of what I'd been seeing over the years. And then as I started using it more and more, you see more trends, and it just gives you more ideas of oh, well, this would fit here. Isometrics are coming, they're kind of in vogue right now, which I think Alex Natera is a guy in Australia, has done an awesome job, has a great course on isometrics specifically. But that was something I started seeing of wow, okay, this person has, doesn't have a very strong ability to vasodilate their capillary network, their blood vessels. That's obviously going to be a problem from just a recovery and a general conditioning perspective. So how do we change that? And so for me, I'm looking for there's always multiple roads that lead to Rome. If you only have one answer for something, you're in trouble. Especially in the pro sport world, it's okay, I know I can get them vasodilated systemically through a dry sauna, which I'm sure is something we'll talk about. Yeah. We could do it through blood flow restriction, and that doesn't have to be active. That can be passive. You can do it through your breath, and you can do it through isometrics. Now you're just using a different driver for all of these different ideas, really just for the desired outcome. But you can use each one with a different athlete, depending on what they want to do. Not everybody's going to use a breathing device. And I'm well aware of that. So it's okay, well, how can I get that same response another way?
Well, talk to me about this Moxie monitor. Is that what you call the muscle oxygenation saturation? How does it work? What's it measuring for? Who is it helping? Because I brought up one of our athletes we cook for had a concussion during the season, and of course, all sorts of athletes in different sports go through and have different sorts of injuries, and oxygen, of course, plays a role, I'm sure, with all of them. Tell us a little bit more about how that one works.
Yeah, so here, I've actually got one here. So pretty small. I mean, it's about an inch and a half tall, So there's a lot to say about the concussion part's interesting, because we'll talk about that. So Moxies have actually been around for a number of years. You hear about them a little more in some of the endurance sports world. I know the Norwegian triathlon team is using them a lot. They're doing some unbelievable stuff from the tech side, especially. But obviously, they're they've got kind of a three-headed monster there that's dominating the tri world at the moment. So you're looking at think about hemoglobin. There are two readouts within the graph that you get from the Moxy. So it's using a near infrared light to pick up, and that picks up hemoglobin and myoglobin and oxygen. So it can't separate out myoglobin and hemoglobin. So you get a number off of that. And really what that number is, that's not the sexy one. Like oxygen is the one that gets all the attention. And oxygen is like our gas, essentially like the gas that you're putting in a tank, where hemoglobin and myoglobin, that's almost like how big's your gas tank. So and the bigger the gas tank, maybe I have, 90% oxygen available in an area. But I have a 15-gallon tank, like I'm driving a Mazda Miata or something, is 60% with a 30-gallon tank. Like I'd probably rather have that. That's just more performance potential when you start seeing that. The bigger the tank, the more performance potential you really have. Now you start seeing a lot of different things off of that. Like, okay, well, can they fill up their tank? So can they fill that area with oxygen? So can they deliver oxygen, or can they get it down to, can they use up all the oxygen in the area? So can they utilize? Most non-injured elite athletes can utilize very well, and delivery is usually more of a limiting factor for them in my experience. Now, injured tissue in general cannot utilize oxygen. So that was something that was again, this was eye-opening for me. You've got a guy that goes down with a hamstring. And again, you're looking at okay, you injure muscle fiber. Well, okay, if I'm injuring muscle fiber, I've got to be injuring vascular tissue as well. So it's just something well, yeah, no kidding. But I had never really thought about it from that perspective. And you just started to see okay, as they're returning in a running progression, their intensity, it was almost step by step with how much oxygen could they utilize at that point. Because usually you'll slowly start to utilize oxygen again, coming back from a muscular injury, no matter what the severity. And surgeries are the same way. It's just more drawn out. But you have you're slowly starting to utilize oxygen again. But, let's say you could get to 10% of how much oxygen you have left in your quad, as an example, initially. Now you're coming back from that injury and you're only 40%. Okay, you would see that on the field when you're going through a running progression, and maybe they can only get to 50 or 60% of their perceived intensity. And then as that trended downwards and they started using more and more oxygen, you would see you wouldn't have to say it ever, which was the cool thing. You'd see them start to get faster and faster. Their intensity just picks up as that ability improves. So that would always be one of the first things you'd start to see. And then after that, you'd see they'd start to, it was releasing all that tension once they built it up. Because when you use a muscle, you create tension. Well, sports and just daily living in general, it's about creating tension and relaxing tension, which is why the breath is so interesting. The breath's just the communicator of all your systems at that point. Right. So being able to let's say they got to 80% of their intensity. Well, normally they could probably release that tension, within 5, 10, 30 seconds. They might not release that tension for 3 minutes early on. And so being able to see that in real time, there's a 2-second delay. So I guess not fully in real time. But being able to see that, it just helped with intent so much more of okay, hey, maybe we're doing 10-yard sprints today, but instead of normally, maybe this takes us 10 minutes, this might take us half an hour today because we're letting your body release that tension. And so we're taking the threat away. Because when you occlude a muscle, you create that tension, you can't let it go. You create, it's called an occlusion. So that's what opens up your blood vessels as well. There's two different kinds of occlusions. I don't know that we need to get into that per se, but as you open up those blood vessels, that's great from a recovery perspective. That's not so great from an in the moment, heat of the battle performance perspective. That's when you see, if you watch a 400-meter runner and you just see, they're eventually going to fall apart. And it's just like, just trying to survive. That's what you see on the baseball field. That's what you see in anything when they just like, it looks like they're out of gas. A pitcher can't throw strikes anymore, whatever. They've lost coordination because they created that occlusion. They can't release the tension to then re-deliver oxygen. That was a super long-winded answer, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, well, and I recall in my triathlon days of a coach telling me that the non-clinical term, the non-specific, scientific term was bonking. So I guess how do you use the device? Like, are you doing exercises on it? It sounds like you can wear it or do something with it as you're exercising. I guess explain that.
Depending on where you want to put it, like just from a general systemic perspective over time, I've seen the quad be one of the better places you can put it. But let's say you just put it on your quad, you leave it. So we can do it. You can get in the water with it. You can do anything with it. So like and guy that really mentored me, his name's Brian Kozak. He was huge, and he just loves, like, again, it's always proving your biases wrong, or maybe they end up being correct. So, but you got to play with it to really understand. So it's something like I worked out with it. I mean, I still work out with it almost every day. And then you just have to start using it a lot. So if my intent is, if I'm bodybuilding, just as an example, like I know the intent of my training, so I can drive that, and I can drive my recovery periods by what the Moxie is telling me. So, or if, man, I want to really focus on coordination, like, okay, well, coordination, I don't want to get into that occlusion state. Coordination can look like a number of different things, but I want to try to drive optimal coordination and make sure I can, like on the graph, it would look like the lines are running in parallel, whether they're up or down. It doesn't have to be straight across, but they look like they're in parallel. They're never crossing. And that is true, like physiological coordination.
Okay. So this is something you actually wear. It's not like a breath device. You're not like breathing in it and doing, okay. Got it. So muscle oxygen saturation it's different than like pulse ox. It's different than blood ox, right?
So pulse ox is really just giving you your arterial oxygen level.
Yep.
I'll use pulse ox when I'm doing some different breathing activities with people.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I'm going to throw this on the leg, and like probably an even easier way to start thinking about it. Like if I have one device on, I'm looking at local intra muscular coordination. If I'm looking at two, if I have two on, maybe one on my left, one on my right leg, that's I can look at intra and intermuscular coordination. So what's the left versus the right look like? How am I coordinating those things? And then again, like no matter what you want to use, like if I want to do some breath work, like you can see the response. What you may not think is systemic, like you start to get a systemic idea as you use it more and more. Early on, I'd say just use one device, look at the intramuscular coordination, and how can you manipulate that by your training or whatever you're doing.
Got it.
Or modality for that matter. I mean, I know we'll talk about some different modalities. Like I've used the newbie a lot, or the ARP wave, similar devices. The newbie's just taking that, I think, a step further, continuing to take that further, but or a flywheel is a good example. I've seen that coordinate things really well for people. Like if you're using a K-box or an Exerfly, to see how well intramuscular coordination picks up with certain modalities.
So an example of, like you said, you would start stacking, right? Certain therapies or modalities with certain measurements. Like, so would you have someone stack like wearing the Moxie monitor while using the Newbie? Which, for those that aren't listening, the Newbie is a device that I wrote about in my book when I met Garrett, the creator of it, about 5-6 years ago, and it's a electrical simulation that uses direct current instead of alternating current. Is that right? Right.
Correct. This is probably not the how exactly they'd phrase it, but I'd almost say like it picks up a number of different things. Like you'll scan the body. Our whole body works off direct current. So like all of our tissues have to communicate. So that's where water starts becoming really important because water is obviously transmits electrical current, but it'll almost get stuck, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, over certain areas in the body. And so, from an injury perspective, like I've seen it flip some things that pretty impressive. In pro sports, you have so many things that, a lot of times you're throwing the kitchen sink at people because you're just trying to get people back as quick as you can. That's like, so when you see things that are like maybe 0.5% or 1% better, the newbies multiple percents better. I've seen that flip some stuff and get guys over the hump pretty impressively. But you could put a ankle in water with the newbie current. You can kind of search and it'll find these different areas, call them kind of like neuro hotspots. I've seen them. It's a lot of stecco points for those of your listeners that have looked into the fascial manipulation world. They're just like where different layers or planes of fascial tissue meet a lot of times. But I think even to take that a step further, and on the water subject, I think you have an increase. This would be my theory. So I think you'd have an increase in like hyaluronic acid in an area, because when that happens, you have things become too viscous in an area. And so you have that stickiness, for probably lack of a better word, within tissue. And so things just don't move quite as smoothly. And so the newbie picks that up. Now, you can train with it also, and that's a soreness very few people have experienced.
Like actually, yeah, work out while you're using it, right? Yeah, I've used it a couple times at an event when they were just demoing before they had launched, and then at their facility in Austin with Garrett. And I definitely have. You mentioned neural hotspots, so I've got like a slight tear in my infraspinatus. My right shoulder, my rhomboids are all effed up. I was a baseball pitcher in high school and probably overthrew and had an injury that didn't properly heal. And I was a mascot in college, and my cervical spine, I had a bulged disc and C5, C6. And I've got my share of issues in my tissues. And I think I'm going to need to take a trip down to Scottsdale to have, because you have a newbie, right? So this is like one of the tools you use, right? Yeah. Because I need to be able to like use it right. And yeah, so, okay, cool. So we've talked about the Moxie monitor, and I talked about the newbie. So these examples of devices that you can use to both measure and help progress through, healing certain injuries. Are you seeing a lot of other strength coaches or trainers, whether they're in the private space or on a pro sports team, on a staff? Are you seeing a lot of them using these like these two modalities at all, or no?
So there's a few people in pro sports using the Moxie. I've talked to a number of them, just trying to help them understand it, because it is, it's pretty intimidating when you first get it, and you're like, you have so much. When you're in the pro sports world, everybody's trying to tell you how their product's so great, and you're just getting stuff thrown at you constantly. So that's where just like the network of like whom you trust, and like people that have used it at a high level. That's what you really start to sift questions. It's just a matter of, do they have the time to go all in and truly understand what the technology can give them? Because that can be intimidating with the Moxie. But I will say, like, there's got a couple people in the NHL talked to pretty extensively about it. MLB, there's a couple teams that are kicking it around now. But I've used it with a number of NFL athletes as well. So like it's just, I think, a matter of time and somebody being able to really put the effort and energy into it, or, bring somebody in to help them understand it better.
Right.
But there's, again, is any strength coach or PT trainer, anybody, like, you're always going to have an intent of what you're doing. And I think that's what made it just make sense for me, because it's like, okay, like, this is just going to make my intent sharper. Like, it makes you be more sniper-esque with what you're doing. Like, I remember the conversation I was having with our GM one time of like, okay, I got to find a way to just take emotion out of this. And that's really what led me to the Moxie, because if I don't think a player is ready, that's great. But if he's telling like the front office or the manager or whomever, like, hey, I'm ready, or his agent, like, it's just my word against his at this point. And that's not going to be helpful for anybody. So that's really what I was like, man, we just need to find a way to take our emotion out of it, because, hey, even if you're saying you're good, this is saying you're not. Or maybe it flips the other way too. It's like, hey man, you're doing way better than you think you are right now. You're ahead of schedule. I will say, like, one thing that was fascinating for me was you just start to see our bodies are working on a certain timeline, and like, we can shave off like a day here or there, which in the grand scheme of things is important. But I do think there's a clear reason why you see a lot of people return from injuries and then get re-injured, because there's just certain steps that can't get skipped just physiologically. So guys aren't returning optimally all the time. Sometimes you need more time. Sometimes you just maybe you're just leaving something smaller out. Because I started seeing a lot of trends that, like, I'll be the first to admit I made plenty of mistakes throughout the years. I mean, still do, but you're trying to get better and limit the mistakes, especially at the highest level when you want to be playing for championships, or setting records for guys that are on teams that aren't in playoff contenders. Because guys are trying to take and girls are trying to take care of their families at the end of the day. That's a big part of why they do it.
100%. Yeah, you bet. I mean, it's their job, it's their livelihoods as athletes, and so getting back on the field and being as close to 100% as possible is, their paycheck depends on it in different sports, depending on whether or not they have a guaranteed contract or not, which is different.
Different in every sport too.
Exactly. So okay, so we talked. I imagine a lot of the people you work with have some sort of like acute or like chronic injury. What about overall general recovery, right? For those that are not necessarily going through something that's acute or specific injury that they've had for a while. What are your favorite kind of hacks to stack for someone for general recovery to kind of speed things up that that make the biggest difference?
Yeah, we've got all sorts of stuff. Honestly, one of the things, like, simple things I think I start with, just say, like, general population people, and this is athletes too, like, start seeing a lot of, you just see systemic carbon dioxide levels start to plummet when people get stressed, when people get injured. And stress, whether that's stress from an injury, mental stress, anything, you see that start to plummet. So whether you employ the oxygen advantage, or I think a lot of that work was taken from Buteyko, and just like, there's some simple strategies you can utilize from a nasal respiration perspective to start to drive up your CO2 level naturally. I've seen that make some very big impacts with people with their recovery and with their sleep, for that matter.
Can you give
So that's
can you give an example? I read, for instance, like James Nestor's book on breath. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
yep.
overall, a big proponent of nasal breathing as opposed to mouth breathing in terms of its effect, a trickle down effect in overall general health. But yeah, I guess driving up CO2 levels naturally. Tell us the importance of that and like how you would do that.
Yeah. So the importance, like, I always think about, like, you'd be shocked how many, like, especially when you put a moxie on somebody, it's like people that are injured or stressed, whatever, they have, we talked about percentages, like, man, they've got their gas tank is pretty much full of oxygen. They just don't have, they don't have the carbon dioxide in this case to pick it up and take it around. It's like being in New York City at Grand Central trying to get a taxi. You've only got so many taxis to take a line of 100 people. So it's really about building more taxis. So you can do that a lot of ways. You can do that in the sunlight, actually. You can do that earthing. We got a lot of different ways to do it. Again, many roads lead to Rome. But something I learned with Buteyko early on was literally just calming your breath all through your nose, just a relaxed 2-second inhale, relaxed 2-second exhale, and then holding your breath at the end of that exhale. Now, I generally start people anywhere from 6 to 10 seconds on that hold. And then you resume that. Like, that's a continuous thing for at least 15 minutes. I've seen dramatic changes when you start getting to 30 plus minutes, when you can do that for 30 plus minutes. And that's where it's like most people, everything's got to be super like challenging for them. Like, no, like you'll get to the point where that hold time gets longer and longer and longer, but that's not the intent. The intent is to, it's like dipping into a warm bath, like it should be comfortable. It shouldn't be super stressful. You want it to start being normal. Like your respiratory frequency will start to drop. Your CO2 level will raise up. Like Buteyko they call it their control pause, where Patrick McCown in the Oxygen Advantage book, they'll talk about the Bolt score. That number will continue to rise as you get more and more, as you get a longer breath hold time in between those breaths. But again, it's comfortable, and to be able to do that continuously for 15 plus minutes, that's not something that you can push. You should never come out of that gasping.
Right.
Again, start there with a lot of folks, just to help start to raise that. I'm gonna say, like, dry sauna is unbelievable. That was one of the first things I was doing even before Moxie. I got put onto that by a group in the Guy Voyer. He's a French osteopath out of Montreal, and this guy named Scott Herrera, who runs a facility down in Dallas. Some of your listeners probably heard of Eldoa. In that world, they're really big into water quality and dry sauna. So like it was like 2016, 17, I was finding a dry sauna in every town we went to. We had one in our clubhouse in Atlanta at that point, which was helpful. But again, like, I didn't have a full appreciation at that point of why. And now it's like, oh, well, makes too much sense. So dry sauna is something I couldn't recommend enough to people. It's going to it's going to vasodilate your system. You're increasing stroke volume of your heart. Man, our systems, especially like our heart and our breath, they're working off volume and frequency. Anytime, like, you're going to compensate when you get stressed or whatever's happening, you get tired when you're working out, your respiratory frequency picks up, your heart rate picks up. So frequency is faster. When you see a decrease in CO2, you see a decrease in hemoglobin, that just means your heart and your breath have to work harder. So you're losing that volume, that ability to control that volume. And a lot of people, work out off heart rate, like, just because it's one of the easiest techs available, I think. everybody's forgetting about stroke volume. That's really important. But dry sauna, again, helps that. And the cardiac research behind dry sauna is fantastic.
Right. Yeah. That I know there's lots of data and increasing, improved mortality rates,
Yeah.
like you said, with heart health. So have you played, and I know there's not as much science on the infrared sauna, but in terms of, I guess, what you're saying you're looking for in terms of vasodilating and increasing stroke volume, is that like just so with dry sauna, you're heating up the air around you, and the idea is, so you're also in a passive state, right? So your nervous system is able to go from fight or flight, to rest and digest, um, you know uh, sympathetic to parasympathetic. So which naturally you'd have the same sort of effect with a infrared sauna, but have you seen similar benefits from an infrared sauna, or what are your thoughts on
So
both?
I've used the infrared sauna. I used it a lot before the dry sauna, actually, and now there's definitely not as much research behind it. But now I'm thinking the timing of when you would use the infrared sauna is the most important. And I got to be honest, I think the heat, like the air around you, and that heat in the dry sauna is like that's a huge part of like spiking, heat shock proteins and
Right.
whatnot,
Right.
and getting that response. But a lot, and just from a simplicity perspective, most athletes, most people don't have the time necessary either, to spend in an infrared sauna. Like it just takes a lot more time.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I like, I know, like personally, like I just don't have that much time in the day.
Yeah.
But I do think the timing of it, like I see the infrared sauna as being a great addition in the mornings. And really you have until about sundown at that point, because that's when infrared light really is not a thing anymore.
Right.
So I I think at that point, sorry, books almost fell. um, I think at that point it's like, okay, infrared sauna at night is probably not the play. But if you have one, I'd do it earlier in the day, because that's Jack Cruz's whole thing about, or I know Huberman talks about it too, about your chronobiology and your circadian rhythms. Infrared light comes out with sun up, and that's really preparing us to be able to absorb UV light midday.
Yep.
And then the end of the day, again, when UV light goes away, sunset is also infrared light. So that's where I think there's a lot of potential there. It's just a matter of, I think, timing and what you have available to you.
Sure.
So if you have an infrared sauna, that would be my recommendation. That would be my opinion. I wouldn't say that's medical advice, but that would make a lot of sense to me. So
cool. Awesome. So we talked about saunas. We talked about the breath experience. On the breath topic, one other question, I guess, and this dovetails into, I think, cold therapy. So I've got a good friend that every Sunday he leads Ice Church out here in Boulder. He's trained with Wim Hof, and so Wim Hof being the intense hyperventilation breath work, followed by cold therapy. What do you see where do you see the place for that sort of breath work and the combination of cold therapy, the timing of that, and how that plays a role? Because I know there's been like recent studies on, timing of cold therapy is key and all that. But
the cold therapy topic's really fascinating. I'll talk about the breath piece first. What I really appreciate, like I've gone through Wim Hof stuff. I really appreciate, like, it's brought in so much attention to the breath. That's where I think he's done a phenomenal job. Like just what I've seen over time, people, like if you don't have a great CO2 level to start, which cold will actually raise it, the hyperventilation piece, and there's more to it than that. So I don't want to bastardize what Wim Hof's doing, because it's also a meditative technique. So I have a lot of respect for that. I personally like, hey, let's set a foundation with our breath. And then I use a device. There's an Inex, again, out of a group in Austin that's about to hit the market. And then there's a Breathe Way Better that I use with a number of athletes. I want to be able to coordinate our breath. So we talked about that physiological coordination. Well, we can do that with our breath. And that's really what like a VO2 max test is looking at, is like, how long can you coordinate your breath before you're going to have a breaking point? You can't shuttle lactate anymore. You can't control your breath. Things spiral out of control for people at that point. So trying to push our breaths per minute in a coordinated fashion and raise the volume. Do a lot with that. Do a lot with tidal volume. So again, we're talking about size of our breath. How much of our lungs can we fill? How much of our, I'd even take it for a second, how much of our trunk can we open up? Because we can mobilize it that way. Do some overspeed breath work. Do a lot of hypercapnic work, which I really like that from a recovery perspective, from vasodilation.
Tell me about that.
That's where I'll use like pulse ox. So the research is really interesting with hypercapnia because it increases cerebral blood flow. So that's one of the big differences between that and hypoxia. So hypoxia, you don't see the increase in cerebral blood flow. You do see a vasodilation effect, but your heart rate will spike also. So people that get like, if you get super anxious, when you're a kid, you go under, you're holding your breath under the pool and you get anxious, you got to come up. You're getting hypoxic at that point. So if you were wearing a pulse oximeter, your arterial blood is starting to drop, probably we'll say 92% and below when you start to get to that point, depending on like if you're trained or not. Hypercapnia is, again, I talked about that slow dip into a pool. Hypercapnia is really the same way, but you're slowing, you're rebreathing a lot of your own air, but you're slowing your breath way down. And then you can control with the Breathe Way Better as an example, you can control how much fresh air gets in. So if you start getting anxious, to me, that's a hypoxic response. Like I'm always looking for, that's something with tech I'm always looking for, is like good tech to me is what makes you more aware of your own body signals. So like the Moxie, as you use that, you start to understand like, okay, here's like what I'm feeling when I'm getting to this state. The breath is the same way. Like if I start getting anxious, like I know my pulse ox, like my number is really starting to drive. It's getting too low. I need to get some fresh air in. And so you're getting a really large systemic vasodilation response. Again, you're getting that cerebral blood flow. And with hypercapnia, you don't see the heart rate spike that you see with hypoxia. So it stays like you stay pretty calm and collected. To me, this is probably an oversimplified, definitely has to be an oversimplified way of thinking about it. But you see athletes that perform really well, like in tight situations, and you see great athletes that don't. I think an easy analogy for people is like, that's the difference between a hypercapnic person and a hypoxic person.
And the hypoxic person would sort of be challenged under pressure. And
yeah, they're going to feel tighter. They're going to feel like, again, their coordination starts to fall apart because everybody's like, I don't care who you are. People are all going to be stressed in those situations. And I think that's a big differentiator for like, okay, who can control that and use that to their advantage. And I think hypercapnia is fascinating. There's really good research behind hypercapnia. There's good research behind intermittent hypoxia as well.
We talked a little bit about that, right? With the kind of the Libo 2 model of adaptive contrast, like EWAT.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And that's something like, I'll give people slow dips into that. If they're not going to use a breathing device, like that's fine. Like you have to have, if you have your principles, you have multiple ways to drive the response you want. Maybe it's not the A model, but it's going to get the job done at the end of the day.
So
and those things are driving CO2. They're driving CO2 levels up. I know we're not, more nasal stuff starts to drive nitric oxide levels up, as does sunlight. So that's, again, sunlight's that's a whole other
if you've
gas
heard,
chapters about
yeah,
that.
if you've heard a theme, the importance of sunlight and its effect on everything, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just subjectively like how you feel when you get it, but just also understanding, what
Yeah.
it does. Like you said, first thing in the morning, how it sets the condition for the rest of the day. Like your morning routine affects how you sleep, right? So like getting sunlight in the morning supports your circadian rhythm and for optimal sleep at night and energy throughout the day. But so regarding the breath work that you've mentioned here, and how we've kind of talked about the Wim Hof hyperventilation, like that example, like heart rate's going to go up on that. So is that
Yeah.
like hypoxic then?
Going to be more of a, they're either, if you're hyperventilating, you're actually blowing off a lot of CO2. So it's not even hypoxic, it's like hyperoxic. So they've got a lot of oxygen, but they've got, again, they don't have any taxis to pick that oxygen up and take it around.
Okay, interesting. Because like, yeah, I always heard like the benefit was like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this because it's gonna super oxygenate your cells, right? And what's that?
I said it does super oxygenate. I don't know that cellularly. I'm not sure. It depends. I think it depends on the base for people. Again.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I use it specifically as a meditative effect, but also to prep myself for the cold therapy I do. So we live at about, speaking of oxygen differences, we live at 8,200 feet in Colorado and in the mountains. So I'm like natural baseline of blood oxygen's like 94, give or take, for me. But we have a private creek on our property, and this time of year, all the snow melt. It's like perfect to get in. It's rushing. Yeah. It's very cold. And so let's talk about cold therapy a bit, and your thoughts on overall benefits, timing of cold therapy for general public, but also like specifically athletes, because a lot of athletes will be listening to this.
Well, there's two phenomenal resources, I think, right now. Well, one, Buteyko was doing a lot of this stuff years ago too, and people, again, it just kind of has disappeared over time. Their big thing is when you immerse yourself in the cold, to be able to control your breath when you get in the water. And that's your sign when you can no longer control your breath. That's a sign that you need to get out. They'll probably get in again, but cold therapy is fascinating. And again, Jack Cruz that's another person I definitely would recommend listeners look into. Like, he's got his whole cold thermogenesis protocol, because it's really about creating light and lowering like you're creating energy within your body, because our cells emit light, and the cold actually helps that. So he's got some really interesting thoughts that I'd embarrass myself, I think, if I tried to secondhand that. Like,
sure.
It's another level of science that he goes into. But again, big fan. Susanna Soberg, actually, she just had a new book come out called Winter Swimming that goes into a lot of the research that's available within the cold space. So I think there's a lot there, especially when you start looking at autumn and winter months, because that's when our body's naturally going to like become more cold adapted. But I think honestly, all times of year, I think there's a lot there. Right. Timing, it depends on what you have to do. I'm probably not, like, you're going to get a spike in your nervous system when you do it. Probably not going to do that right before I go to bed. So right. I'll probably do it a little earlier and maybe I have to have some big decisions coming up in the day, or, I just need a lot of energy. I know I'd spoken with somebody I used to be with Red Bull, that like somebody I really respect in the space that would say he'd always do it right before meetings, even just so he was with it, he was sharp. And I think there's a lot there that we're just on the outer edges of it. But honestly, a rule of thumb for me with any of this stuff is like, if it's been around for thousands of years, like we should probably pay attention to it. Like the sunlight, that's obvious. Cold water, that's where dry sauna's been around for a long time. Like a lot of these things, and like, I mean, the yogis, a lot of the stuff that even comes out now, it's like, oh, research is saying like, great, the yogis were saying this stuff 3,000 years ago. So we've just had our heads in the sand. Earth, the same thing. Like, yeah, they're the kind of the change of electrons from protons to like an influx of electrons. Like, yeah, that should be obvious to us.
Negative ion generation, right? And yeah, its effect on overall state of mind, nervous system, stress levels. So on the cold therapy front, yeah. So I think so if you were to like choose a modality, for post game for an athlete, would you say it would make more sense to do like, just as like you hear of the benefits of like doing a dry sauna post workout to extend the benefits? So
Yeah.
would you suggest, like, if you were to choose timing of like sauna, would you do sauna after a workout or after a game? And would you do cold therapy before a game? Practice?
I honestly, I would. Obviously, you have a window of how long you're going to do something, but that's where I think post game's interesting, because like I think you have a few things, probably more than that, but like that's where I think the breath work is huge. Because again, you just created, no matter what sport you played. I know people think baseball players stand around a lot, but like nobody's thinking about what's going through their mind mentally during that. And I've measured this on guys. Like when you stress somebody out mentally, I could have a Moxie monitor on their quad and I will see an occlusion, like they're running to first base, just standing, at third. So there's a lot, like they're utilizing a lot of energy on the field night to night. It's just, you just have to kind of flip your perspective on how that's being done. But I would definitely do breath work. The sauna is a great option. Dry sauna, I think you start using a lot of passive blood flow restriction, again, because what you're doing with these modalities is you're opening up all your blood vessels. Carbon dioxide, like CO2, is a natural anti-inflammatory. So you're going to help yourself recover better. And then you're not utilizing the lactate because lactate's a fuel. You just built all this lactate, use it to your advantage, store it with something a little more passive. I also like this is something I really dove into now that I'm kicking myself because I didn't take enough advantage of it when I was in the team setting. But the pool, there's so much to offer. Again, this is here right in front of us, thousands of millions of years, whatever you want to believe from an evolutionary perspective.
Like hydrotherapy, like movements in the pool?
Yeah, so actually doing different things in the pool. There's some track coaches I really respect that do a lot of good things with the pool. And there's some people, again, it's just kind of some of the stuff that ebbs and flows. But like people would remember somebody like Marv Marinovich. He's passed now. He was doing a lot of things in the pool from a training perspective. Or there's a lady out in Santa Monica that's been doing it forever that I don't feel like people know about, named Linda Huey. That again, we're talking about rehab, we're talking about training, we're talking about recovery. Like there's just so many options there. Randy Huntington is somebody I really respect in the track and field space. That he told me his rule of thumb, like they're always going to end every session in the pool. And that was just kind of a general mobility, feel good. But his rule of thumb was like, hey, and he's monitoring a lot of things, but if you're just feeling beat up and like you can't do what we have prescribed on the track today, we can do that same workout, obviously with slight tweaks in the pool. So being able to tweak, like, okay, I'm in the deep end, I'm going to have different intent than the shallow end. And that's what, there's all these different people that have used it at a high level over the years. But again, like the ocean is, the oceans, lakes, rivers, like there's so much, or just swimming pools, like there's so much there. And like, I think we're idiots when we start ignoring what nature gave us and start thinking, anytime we think we're smarter than nature, the human body, we are well off course.
Right. Got it. Yeah. So the, well, you're kind of just like overall saying around like the importance of the fundamentals, right? Yeah. Which is sometimes people can get just caught up in the new latest and greatest. And I loved your quote that you mentioned around what good tech looks like to you, like good health and biotech is good tech would be helping you be more aware of your body signals. I love that point, because that's what it's about. Like we're wanting to bring overall awareness through anything that we're doing to the individual, so that collectively between them and their trainer and coach or whoever's supporting them to have an understanding of like what's working, what's not, and how the body is responding. So I just kind of wanted to kind of reflect back on that. I love that point that you mentioned. But in terms of the cold therapy, I know a lot of people can get like afraid of it or turned off by it because it can be a lot when you're not used to it. I've been doing it for quite a while now. So like my muscle memory with it and my brain, and, I'm conditioned, if you will, and trained a bit in that. But still, I noticed that like some sort of breath work prior makes it easier to withstand. So that's whether that's exactly Wim Hof or something else. But like if you're listening, what's that?
It's thermodynamics.
Yeah.
It's just prepping yourself. Like when you talk about like infrared heating from the inside out, like you're really just trying to prep yourself from the inside out when you do something from the breath.
Totally. Yeah. But like if you don't have access, like during the season, like so if you're listening to this and you're in the middle of your season right now, whatever sport you're playing, I know baseball's in the thick of it right now. It might be hard to find, ice, or I don't know what the cold options are like in the facilities. Are they pretty good?
They're usually pretty good with the teams, pending. But yeah, they'll get cold, no doubt.
But at the very least, you can get in a cold shower, and that might be the best way to start, right?
Like, not if you're in Phoenix. There's no cold showers.
No cold. I've heard that. All right. So in all other places besides Phoenix.
Yeah. Just don't go to the desert.
Yeah. And
that's where I would push people towards like what Jack Cruz has done in that space, because I know he's got a very systematic way, like starts with the face. And like you're doing that for a while before you worry about like, then maybe throw ice on yourself or like have ice on yourself. And then you ultimately progress to being submerged. So it's just a more patient way of doing it, I would say. Because if you have access to it, I think it's you just have to be smart about it. Again, if you're starting to hyperventilate when you're in there, like, hey, you need to get out.
Right. Yeah. Keeping calm, controlling the breath. That's always one of my biggest goals when I'm in there. And and contrast therapy. Like, are you a fan of that for like increasing blood flow, like going back and forth between cold and hot? Like, when is the best time to consider that?
It's funny because I mean that's a big thing in pro sports for sure. And honestly, like usually you feel better after that. Like to me, that's something you're probably going to do a little earlier in the day when you're at a facility. Maybe you're not quite ready just to go all in on the cold. Because you should get a vasoconstriction and a vasodilation when you're going back and forth. Like you're honestly, you're just moving blood and opening blood vessels and like some superficial blood vessels as well. So I think there's a place for it. And I think with any of these modalities too, it's like we can have our general rules of thumb, but some people just feel better when they do things at certain times.
Right.
I was talking to an individual yesterday. He was talking about a player he worked with the team. He's like, man, this guy wanted so much like hands-on therapy. He said more than I would ever like recommend to anybody, but like, he's done it in this league for 15 years. Like he clearly knows his body and he's done it at a high level. He clearly knows his body and what he needs better than I do. That's something I'm always quick to tell clients too. It's like I've got my opinions, but you know your body better than I ever will.
Right.
So like we can't ignore that. And it's cool when, again, when we talk about tech, when you start seeing things that corroborate what they're feeling. So that's where I've seen we talk about the control pause or the bolt score. I've seen that be very sensitive to how guys are feeling. I still like the Omega wave. And like, I've seen that be very sensitive to where guys are at, or how their energy is sustained over the day. That's something I definitely noticed with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
what we haven't talked about quite yet is, back to the basics, the fundamentals. I know it's what originally brought us together, nutrition, food. So Amanda, my wife, and I, we run our meal prep performance chef company, Elevated Eats, and what we found is we provide we have the option to do advanced lab testing, blood testing, so comprehensive metabolic panel, micronutrient deficiency test, and a stool test are usually the top three that we're doing, with optional for other ones as well, like genetics and et cetera. We see a lot of trends. It's interesting around the male athletes that we test. A lot of trends around testosterone being on the low side, and that's not just like a thing in athletics. It's overall gen pop. How we look at the ranges and how we might be told, if we're in the general public, that like, oh, your testosterone's fine, you're in the range, but that range looks at like it's based on like healthy 18-year-old males, like all the way up to like 80-year-old males. And so if you're in the range, that should be specific based on age, and the testing companies don't usually do that. So we generally find testosterone being on the low side from the athletes, which you would think that like relative to the general population, that athletes might have testosterone being higher. But what do you think might be the cause of something like that? Could it be like overtraining, like too much stress?
Honestly, you probably see a lot of low vitamin B levels as well, I would imagine.
B as in boy.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Those things, like, that's really driven by nitric oxide. So I think, and this is where I do think there's a light story to this, because you think about a circadian clock and like how thrown off that is by pro sports in general. First and foremost, like, again, baseball is a great example. Like, it's easy to understand like hockey or basketball because those are indoor sports. But baseball, like, yeah, they're outside, but they're usually like, they'll go out for batting practice, say in late afternoon. They're usually at the stadium from 12 or 1 o'clock until 11 or 12 at night. They're inside. Usually the lighting is usually not ideal. There's some companies doing some cool stuff in that space. Like Brainlit is a really interesting one that are playing with that. But again, like, they go there, they're on their phones a lot, or late at night, they're playing video games. So it's like just constant blue light exposure, which, just lowers dopamine, and like you're just seeing a cascade of effects. So I think that's a big part of why you're seeing, like, nutrition's a piece of it, but like, if you can't get that right, then how much, what's 10 pounds off a battleship? It's it's just a downhill, like feed, unfortunately, a feed forward negative effect. Um, but yeah, I mean, they're on their phones. Then they go outside, and usually they have sunglasses on. Not a lot of them wear contacts, but some have contacts. They've got sunscreen on. So it's like, how much light exposure or outside of blue light are they actually getting? And then the game starts. Usually, sun's going down as the game's starting, and then you're playing until under lights until 9, 10 o'clock at night. Games are a little faster this year.
Yeah.
So again, baseball, they're never getting real like red light exposure. Again, that's where I think, or even UV exposure. So I do think, and UV is a big drive. Infrared and UV, the combination are huge drivers for our dopamine levels, and thus like our mitochondrial energy stores. I just think you're going to see the problem continue to get worse, and that's globally. I'm not picking on one sport or the other, but they are. And these guys are in like some sports, they're in meetings all day. So it is. It's like we're trying to turn ourselves into vampires almost, and then we're trying to find like hacking ways out of that rather than, hey, just go outside.
Well, right. So yes, go outside, getting, sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning. And I think our doctor would say like 70% of your body if possible. And which is easier said than done when you're, in major cities. It's hard to do some nude sunbathing. One of our hacks that, we'll suggest guys to do is either, I have a red light right here on my desk, or just through the sun, but like one of the two on your package, on your testicles, as like a hack for testosterone. But you're right. I mean, the lifestyle, the exposure to artificial blue light is a huge issue in our overall world. And specifically an issue for pro athletes inside when they're in the facilities, outside when they're exposed to it for night games, the traveling too late at night, like probably missing out on deep sleep, like key deep sleep, which happens like first thing, usually from like 10 to midnight, and when people go to bed after midnight, like that's deep sleep is probably low, which is affecting all of that.
I can only speak for baseball, but I mean, most guys they'd go to sleep definitely past 2 a.m. Usually, again, they'll go back to the hotel and like play video games or something. And that's just more stimulation, more blue light stimulation in your eye.
So there are ways to hack it, but yes, step one is getting as much sunlight as possible. And so like sunlight in the eyes and on your skin in the morning, for overall circadian rhythm, like usually within like the first hour or two of sunlight, right? And then during the day, that's when you can get vitamin D, right, from the UV in the middle of the day. So
sunlight.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, sunlight stimulates cholesterol and turns it into vitamin D. Exactly. So that's if you have an athlete that has a job outside and he has vitamin D levels, like, I mean, I think you have your answer. I didn't realize this until recently, actually. And myopia is, which in other sports, not baseball, but I think about people that have LASIK surgery, like they're trying to make themselves more myopic. That is the number one sign of low dopamine levels in the eye. So it's like you've almost diagnosed their issue without even having to have much of a conversation beyond that. Like, all right, well, hey, maybe we get outside first thing in the morning and then we talk.
Yeah, right.
The eye is fascinating.
Totally, man. Yeah. So as a way to hack that blue light exposure, so you can wear things called blue blockers. I don't know if you've ever saw any of your athletes wearing blue blockers to block you got yours right there. I love it. So basically when the sun sets, historically speaking, like our ancestors, our only other source of light were candles and fire until Edison came along and we had artificial, blue light that was created in our world. And so our bodies, our circadian rhythms were designed not to receive artificial blue light past sunset. And so when you are exposed to that throws off your melatonin. So that destroys your melatonin production, which negatively affects a lot of things, including sleep and overall recovery. So like the blue blockers Andrew just showed you, that can be a simple hack. You could just Google different blue blocker companies that exist out there and you can find some stylish pair. I would imagine
these are raw optics.
Raw Optics. Love Matt. I've actually interviewed Matt Maruka on my podcast. Great young guy doing awesome work. He's worked with Jack Cruz a lot too, that you mentioned. But yeah, it's tough, man, for their lifestyles. But like, when you're home. So the other thing I was going to mention is like athletes are home half the season. So they have a little bit more control on the lighting. You should see our house at night. Like we have red lights everywhere. I'm sure people drive by, they think it's like the red light district, wonder what's going on in there. But like this light behind me here, right? So this is a red light, a cheap bulb that we found. There's a couple different good options that sell low cost red lights that aren't like infrared or anything, but will affect your melatonin a lot less than artificial blue light, and it will just get you ready for sleep, right? Like that's kind of what we need to do, right? For evening routines is to like support the conditions that will help you sleep better. Yeah.
It's just like our modern world, it's hard. And again, like I've been on a Jack Cruz rabbit hole as you're probably picking up. Like he made the comment, which really stuck with me though, of you can't get well in the same environment you got sick in. So like we have like all these chronic issues that are coming up, but what are we doing to change it really? Like, I'm going to work out more. I'm going to eat a little better. Like, yeah, those are nice additions, but there's something bigger I think we're missing. Like we've been talking about this a fair amount at my house lately, because it's like, our daughter right now is about to turn 1, and like it's funny because her clock is like she's about ready to go to bed once the sun goes down, and then she gets up. Let's say give or take an hour in either direction, but it's the same way on the front end of getting up. So it's like, okay, well, how can we, from a lighting perspective, so do you go red light? Do you go UV light? Something I've been thinking about more and more. Do you go, that'd be a black light for most people. Do you just go candles? Like I try to be like, I'm probably going to take things more to the extreme, as I think you are. But like you obviously have to find out what works best for you. But we're definitely, in the blue light world, we're definitely not doing a lot of things real well. And I don't think there's help in sight on that either, just from people are on their phones constantly,
there is, just so people know, on their phone, right? You can remove the blue light and increase it to be as warm as possible. It's still not ideal to be on your phone so late at night, but that is definitely, a way to help.
Is that flux, or is that something already on the phone?
Yeah. No, it's you can do it on your phone through, no, there's a picture of our dog.
Just the brightness.
Yeah. So like you can tell like there's like a little yellowish hue to it. It's a feature inside of iPhone, or I would imagine other non-iPhones would have it too. It's under display and brightness, and then you go to it's actually night shift. So I have night shift mode on 24/7. And then you can change the brightness from there. But yeah, night shift removes the blue light as much as possible. Yeah. But cool, man. Well, any other parting thoughts and that you would have for everyone listening in? I appreciate everything you've shared so far and love the work you're doing, Andrew.
Yeah. Probably got some long-winded on a few things, but honestly, like I'm always like I'm always searching out people that are just putting a lot of things together. But what I can say about all of those people, if there's like a golden thread throughout what we talked about for the last hour, is like, and like true experts in the field, they do the basics better than anybody else. And like, I think we all, like, as you're learning and developing as like whatever you are, strength coach, clinician, um, you're just taking care of yourself. I think we all go through this period where we try to overcomplicate things. But I think again, the experts, they're like ducks. Like there's so much happening under the surface for the simplicity that's happening on top of the water that like that's what makes them an expert. So choose your experts wisely.
Wise words right there, and another solid on point metaphor. I've enjoyed your metaphors today, big time. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for all the work you're doing in the world. We're gonna definitely have information to share. I guess, what is the best way for people to get in touch if they're interested in working with you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. I don't post a lot, but I check in. So when people send DMs and stuff on Instagram, I'd have to give it to you for the show notes. And honestly, even email Andrew at Continuum. It's CONTINUUMHP.com. Those are probably the best ways to reach me.
Great. Awesome. Well, we'll be sharing this far and wide, of course, through our client base of athletes and to everyone else in our network. And excited to hear how people resonate with everything that we've covered today. And I'm sure they'll be interested in reaching out to possibly work with you. So keep up the great work in the world, my friend. And thanks again.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, next time we'll have to have you in person. This is the live. We don't have a live studio audience quite yet, but we do have a nice set here. So I'll have to get you out to Boulder sometime soon, my friend. And
I don't need too many excuses to come out to Boulder, so count me in.
We can do some cold therapy, get in the creek, and have a lot of fun. All right, brother.
All right, man. Take care.
Peace.